The descent pods weren't designed for atmospheric storms, but Theo Harmon had approximately 3 seconds to appreciate that fact before the violet lightning turned his instruments into a light show that would have been beautiful if it were not so catastrophically timed. His thesis advisor had warned him about solo field research. Linguistic anthropology, Professor Vesh had said, her third eye blinking skeptically, generally works better when the linguist survives the first contact. Theo had laughed then. He wasn't laughing now, as the pod scraped through canopy layers that felt less like trees and more like the universe's most aggressive wash. The impact knocked his head against the restraint pad hard enough to make his vision swim with stars that definitely weren't on any navigation chart. When the world stopped spinning, he found himself tilted at 40 degrees, in a clearing surrounded by vegetation that pulsed with bioluminescence, as if the forest had decided to throw a rave specifically to celebrate his terrible piloting skills. His emergency beacon was dead. The communications array had transformed into modern art. The hull breach wasn't critical, but the hissing sound suggested his pod now had all the atmospheric integrity of a cheese grater. Theo pulled himself free, stumbled onto soil that felt oddly springy, and had just enough time to think this was going in his dissertation's complications section when he saw them. They moved through the glowing underbrush like liquid shadow given purpose, and Theo's heart performed gymnastics his cardiovascular system hadn't approved. Humanoid, definitely. Bipedal, roughly his height. But there was something in the way they flowed between the trees that made him think of dancers who'd memorized every step of a performance he couldn't even hear the music for. The one who emerged first stopped 3 meters away, and Theo forgot about his crashed pod entirely. She looked human enough that his brain wanted to categorize her as familiar, right up until the details started registering. Silver markings traced her face like someone had drawn constellations along her jaw and temples. And they were glowing, actually glowing, shifting through patterns too complex to follow. Her eyes caught the bioluminescent light and threw it back in shades between amber and violet. When she tilted her head, studying him with an intensity that made him feel like a particularly interesting lab specimen, he noticed her fingers had one too many joints, creating movements that were just slightly wrong in a way that triggered every uncanny valley instinct evolution had gifted him. She said something in a language that sounded like music played through water, and Theo did what any trained xenolinguist would do in his situation. He held up his hands in what he desperately hoped was a universal gesture for "please don't kill the idiot who can't fly," and tried to smile in a way that communicated friendly incompetence rather than threatening incompetence. Her markings flickered in a new pattern. If he didn't know better, he'd swear she was amused. Behind her, at least a dozen others had materialized from the forest, all watching him with that same intense curiosity. One of them, a male with markings that covered half his chest in geometric patterns, said something that made several others' markings pulse in what Theo's anxiety-soaked brain interpreted as laughter. Great. He'd crashed on a planet where even the bioluminescent responses were mocking him. His dissertation was going to be fascinating, assuming he lived long enough to write it. The woman with the constellation face gestured toward the forest, and Theo's survival instincts wrestled briefly with his anthropological curiosity before curiosity won by technical knockout. He followed, trying not to think about every first contact protocol he was violating. His damaged translator unit hung uselessly from his belt, occasionally sparking and muttering fragments that sounded like recipe instructions in a language nobody had spoken for 3,000 years. The village materialized gradually, structures woven from living vines that responded to touch by shifting their configurations. Theo watched one dwelling literally rearrange its entrance as a child approached, the doorway widening and lowering automatically. He pulled out his recorder, then remembered it had died somewhere between the lightning strike and his face meeting the restraint pad. Perfect. The most significant xenological discovery of his career, and he'd be documenting it with interpretive dance and strongly worded memory. The woman led him to a dwelling larger than the others, its vines braided in patterns that hurt to look at directly, as if they contained too many dimensions for his visual cortex to properly process. She touched the entrance, and it opened like a mouth, which wasn't disturbing at all. Inside, the temperature was perfect, the lighting soft and blue-green, and there were what would appear to be furniture analogs growing directly from the floor. Theo's tired brain decided this was fine. Everything was fine. He was simply having a minor spacecraft malfunction, followed by a light bout of alien hospitality. She offered him something that looked like fruit, if fruit had decided to glow and hum slightly. Theo's xenobiology training kicked in, reminding him that accepting unknown food was how researchers ended up as cautionary tales in undergraduate seminars. He smiled apologetically and mimed stomach upset, which probably translated as something horrifying in her culture. But her markings pulsed in that pattern he was starting to recognize as amusement. She set the fruit aside and instead brought water in a container that seemed to be made of solidified light. The water tasted clean and cold, and Theo decided if it killed him, at least he'd die hydrated. Night fell with the kind of speed that suggested this planet's rotation was enthusiastically committed to its job. Outside, sounds emerged from the forest that made Earth's scariest predators sound like a children's choir. Something roared with enough bass to vibrate Theo's sternum. Another thing answered with a shriek that probably violated several acoustic physics laws. The woman noticed his tension and said something soft, her markings shifting to cooler blues and greens. Theo pointed to himself. "Theo," he said clearly. She cocked her head, and he tried again, tapping his chest. "Theo." Her markings brightened. She touched her own chest, and the sound she made was like wind chimes arguing with a waterfall. But somewhere in there, he caught something that sounded like avalier. He tried to repeat it, mangled it spectacularly, and her markings did that flickering thing again. Definitely laughter. At least his incompetence was entertaining across species barriers. She gestured to a raised platform covered in something soft, clearly indicating he should rest. Theo's exhausted body overruled his anxious mind's 17 objections. He settled onto what turned out to be the most comfortable surface he'd encountered in 3 star systems, and Avalier moved to another platform across the room. The walls hummed gently, and the dwelling's bioluminescence dimmed to a restful twilight. Outside, something screamed like a turbine dying in key. Theo glanced at the door, then at Avalier, who made a dismissive gesture with those 2 jointed fingers. He interpreted this as, "Ignore the death sounds. Perfectly normal." His translator chose that moment to sputter to life, producing the phrase, "Ceremonial witnessing begins," before dying again, with a sound like disappointment made audible. Theo closed his eyes, deciding tomorrow would be soon enough to figure out what that meant. Theo woke to silence, which was immediately suspicious, because forests didn't do silence unless something was very wrong or very about to be wrong. He sat up, his back cracking in 3 places that suggested the comfortable platform hadn't entirely forgiven him for crash landing on this planet. Avalier was already awake, standing near the entrance, with her markings blazing so brightly she could have guided spacecraft to landing pads. The patterns racing across her skin looked frantic, complicated, and somehow official, in a way that made his stomach clench. He stood, joints protesting, and moved to the doorway. What waited outside made his brain temporarily forget how to process visual information. Warriors. Hundreds of them, arranged in circles that radiated outward, like someone had decided to build a very intimidating flower garden using armed people as petals. Their weapons stood planted in the earth before them, and every single person was utterly, completely still. Their markings pulsed in synchronized patterns that created waves of light rolling through the assembled crowd. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. It was the kind of thing that happened right before someone got sacrificed to appease an ancient god. And Theo was statistically the most sacrificable person present. He turned to Avalier, gesturing frantically at the warrior convention outside. She said something that sounded patient, which wasn't helpful because he didn't speak patient in her language. He fumbled for his translator, shook it hard enough to potentially void warranties on 3 planets, and was rewarded with a crackle of static, followed by the words, "bond, recognition," and "irrevocable presence confirmed." Theo's linguistic training kicked in despite his panic. Bond, recognition, sense. His mind raced through an anthropological frameworks, while his survival instincts screamed that maybe now wasn't the time for academic analysis. He'd stayed here, overnight, in her dwelling. He pointed at himself, then at the platform he'd slept on, then at Avalier, his hands moving in increasingly desperate gestures that probably looked like he was trying to semaphore his way out of a cultural incident. Her markings shifted to something gentler, almost sympathetic. She touched his shoulder with those strange fingers, and the contact sent a small jolt through him that felt electromagnetic, like her nervous system operated on frequencies his body wasn't designed to receive. She spoke slowly, and his translator caught fragments. Choice made, witnessed, cannot unknow. A laugh bubbled up from somewhere in Theo's chest, high and slightly unhinged. He was bonded, married, engaged. Whatever the local equivalent was, he'd apparently done it by accident, through the revolutionary method of sleeping in the wrong room. His thesis committee was going to have questions. So many questions. Assuming he survived to face a thesis committee which was looking increasingly optimistic compared to his current situation. One of the warriors, an older male whose markings covered most of his visible skin in patterns that suggested significant rank, stepped forward. He spoke, and Theo's translator managed chieftain and daughter before giving up entirely and producing what sounded like a recipe for fermented grain beverage. Chieftain, daughter. Theo looked at Avalier with fresh horror. He hadn't just accidentally bonded with someone. He'd accidentally bonded with someone important. Someone whose father apparently commanded enough warriors to stage a small invasion or a very large wedding. And Theo wasn't sure which option scared him more. Avalier said something to the assembled warriors, her markings flaring bright, and 321 heads turned to look at Theo with an intensity that made him want to apologize to his ancestors for ending their genetic line in such a spectacularly awkward way. The translator sputtered one more phrase before dying with theatrical finality. The human will speak. Theo opened his mouth, realized he had absolutely nothing useful to say, and did what any trained scientist would do when faced with impossible circumstances. He waved awkwardly and said, "Hi, everyone. Lovely morning. Nice weapons. Very pointy." The chieftain's dwelling turned out to be less a building and more a geological argument that had somehow resolved itself into architecture. Theo sat on something that might have been a chair or might have been a patient rock formation, while Avalier's father, Solvan, towered over him with the kind of presence that made gravity feel negotiable. Around them, scholars worked frantically, with crystalline devices that hummed and projected holographic symbols, trying to bridge the gap between his mangled translator and actual communication. Solvan spoke, and the symbols rearranged themselves into something Theo's battered device could process. You remained through darkness, through fear sounds, through vulnerability hours. Why? Theo blinked at the directness. Because leaving seemed rude? Also, there were things outside that sounded like they gargled starship fuel for fun. The translation crystals flickered uncertainly, and one of the scholars made an adjustment that caused the symbols to pulse apologetically. Solvan's markings shifted into patterns Theo was learning to read as consideration. You did not flee when exit was offered. Daughter gestured clearway when the ridge stalker called. You chose remaining. The memory surfaced with uncomfortable clarity. Avalier had pointed to the door during one of those bone-vibrating roars, and Theo had interpreted it as her saying the walls would hold, not as her offering him escape. He'd smiled and settled back down, trusting her reassurance that didn't exist. His face heated with embarrassment that transcended cultural boundaries. Among Castarii, Solvan continued through the increasingly sophisticated translation matrix. Words carry wind weight. Actions carry stone weight. You stayed when frightened. Accepted shelter. Shared vulnerable hours. This is choosing, whether intended or unknowing. One of the younger warriors, whose markings suggested recent maturity, asked something that made several others' patterns flicker with what Theo was now certain was amusement. The translation came through. Do humans truly require verbal contracts for all life bonds? Must you speak promises to know you have made them? Another voice added, this explains the abundance of human legal speakers in galactic records. Laughter rippled through the assembled Castarii, their markings creating waves of light that would have been mesmerizing if Theo weren't the joke's focal point. Despite everything, he found himself laughing too, because they weren't wrong. Humans did love their contracts, their written agreements, their verbal confirmations of things that maybe should have been obvious through simple presence. Avalier moved to stand beside him, and through the translation matrix, she explained what the bond actually meant. Mutual advocacy, shared resources, political standing to speak for each other, priority of presence in crisis. Not ownership, not even necessarily romance, but recognition that two lives had become structurally connected through demonstrated trust. Theo's mind raced through implications. Refusing would mark humans as beings who took without acknowledging, who fled responsibility when it appeared in unfamiliar shapes. But accepting meant obligations he couldn't fully map, changes he couldn't predict. His career, his research, his entire trajectory had just collided with 321 witnesses and a culture that measured commitment in choices already made. He looked at Avalier, whose markings had shifted to something cautious, almost vulnerable, despite her obvious rank and capability. She'd offered him shelter when he'd crashed, broken, and lost. She'd shared food, space, protection. And he'd stayed, repeatedly, because some part of him had already chosen to trust before his conscious mind caught up. Okay, Theo said, his voice steadier than expected. I accept, not because I fully understand, but because pretending my choices meant nothing would be the actual lie here. Solvan's markings blazed approval. Avalier's hand found his, those extra joints creating a grip that felt strange and right simultaneously. Outside, 321 warriors struck their weapons against the earth in rhythmic acknowledgement, and Theo realized he'd just become part of something his thesis proposal had never anticipated. His advisor was going to need extensive footnotes,